guys are ready, Tim is in the school.
Good afternoon. I'm Brendan Keefe, Chief Investigator with Atlanta News First. You're watching Atlanta News First Plus, and you're watching us on your various devices out there, and we thank you for joining us right now. This is continuing live coverage of both the Trump investigation, the indictments, and the impending surrender of the former President of the United States, which is expected to happen tomorrow. Fani Willis, the District Attorney here in Fulton County, Georgia, has given all of the defendants, 19 of them, until noon tomorrow to turn themselves in. If they don't, then those arrest warrants that have already been issued by the grand jury would be activated and they could be arrested. But right now, we do expect the former president, Donald Trump, seen here, to turn himself in. He has said on Truth Social, his own social network, that he's going to turn himself in sometime tomorrow. Largely and politically, this is seen as sort of counter-programming to tonight's GOP debate, which is the first of the primary season. And he's expected to turn himself in really as that news cycle is still going on. He does have until noon on Friday, but he said he's going to turn himself in on Thursday. We are seeing a lot of action right now here in Fulton County as multiple defendants, co-defendants, and alleged co-conspirators have turned themselves in already at the Fulton County Jail at Rice Street. If you're wondering why this is happening at the jail, as we take a live look at the picture now of the front gate for the Fulton County Jail, why the jail? Why not the courthouse? We've seen in other jurisdictions they turn themselves into the courthouse. It's because there are two distinct processes here in Georgia that may be different from other jurisdictions. Here, first, you're arrested, typically then you're indicted, and then you have an arraignment. And those are distinct processes. In this case, there was an indictment, then there must be a custodial arrest. They have to turn themselves in. And even for a brief moment, these defendants, and soon to be the former President of the United States, will be arrested. They will be in custody of the Fulton County Sheriff's Office for a brief moment before they're released on these pre-negotiated bonds. Those bonds, even if it's not pre-negotiated, if it occurs in the courthouse, the small courtroom at the jail, that's not really an arraignment. Here in Georgia, the arraignment is a separate matter where a plea is entered. That's sometimes called a first appearance in other jurisdictions. Here, it's just that plea hearing is that arraignment. That is not going to occur until the week of September 5th, according to DA Fani Willis, who's asked the court for that to happen the week of September 5th. So we're not going to see video of Rudy Giuliani today or the former president tomorrow in turning themselves in, other than the motorcade shot, which is similar to what we saw in New York City when the Manhattan DA indicted the former president, Donald Trump, and we saw a motorcade from the airport to lower Manhattan to what they call the Tombs, the central booking area in Manhattan. And that was all done essentially in the DA's office. He was fingerprinted, released without a mugshot. What we are going to see here are mugshots, and here's why. The sheriff of Fulton County has said that these defendants are not going to be treated differently than any other people who are accused of a crime in Fulton County. That is really hyperbole because it's impossible not to treat the former president of the United States differently because he's the only defendant ever to have entered the Fulton County Jail with a full Secret Service detail. Every president of the United States for the rest of their lives, even after they leave 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, is entitled to lifetime Secret Service protection. And that means the Secret Service has a lot to say here because just because their client, so to speak, their protectee, is accused of multiple felonies doesn't end their duty to protect him for the rest of his life. And that includes in the Fulton County Jail, maybe particularly in the Fulton County Jail because it is notoriously one of the worst jails in the nation. And that's not any kind of editorial comment. Even the current sheriff would argue that because he is pushing for a new jail himself. He infamously or famously wheeled in multiple wheelbarrows into the county commissioners with pieces of the jail that inmates had broken off to make shivs. A shiv is a knife that's fashioned by someone in jail or prison And in this case, they're literally breaking off pieces of the steel and concrete in the jail because the jail itself is crumbling and turning them into weapons. And he wheeled those into the commissioners to say, this is what's happening in the Fulton County Jail. So the jail is notorious. There have been multiple deaths. My colleague, investigator Andy Parati, has documented this as well. There have been multiple deaths and increasing in that jail. The jail is housing many people who are unindicted, some people who don't have attorneys. That is where these clients are treated very differently, not just because of their status or former status, but also because of their access to proper legal counsel. They have lawyers. Those lawyers have met with Fonnie Willis, most of them now, and they have negotiated plea agreements, or not plea agreements, rather bond agreements. So these are consent orders. There's Rudy Giuliani, we saw just a moment ago. That's in Lower Manhattan in Foley Square, where this is a file video, even though we are live right now. Rudy Giuliani was the attorney for Donald Trump, his personal attorney. So he didn't hold an official position in the government. He was the personal attorney to Donald Trump, who was the president of the United States. And now Rudy Giuliani himself is charged with multiple felonies, including RICO, which is the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. He's charged under the state RICO law, which mirrors closely the federal law, but it's even broader here. And what's interesting is that Rudy Giuliani, when he was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, he used RICO to go after the crime families in New York City. He even also used them to go against people who weren't crime families. So he used the RICO statute broadly, and now he's criticizing the use of the RICO statute to go after him, which is interesting. Rudy Giuliani right now is on the ground here in Fulton County as we speak live. He is on his way from PDK, that's DeKalb Peachtree Airport, and he is on his way to the Rice Street Jail, we believe. We believe his consent order is already in place in terms of what his bond is going to be. And he is going to be fingerprinted. He is going to receive a mugshot. Here now a live look again at the jail. And we expect, now there is another entrance, by the way, so we might miss him here, but we do have multiple crews down at the jail. We also have our helicopter up in the air to get these pictures for you. But essentially, Rudy Giuliani today will turn himself into the Rice Street Jail. He will then go on a brief exam. He will then be fingerprinted. He will have his mugshot taken, and then he will be released on this pre-negotiated bond. The judge has already signed the order on the bond. So there's a lot of confusion over what is a bond? What's the difference between a bond and bail? I hear bail sometimes, I hear bond. They are sometimes used interchangeably, but they actually have different meanings under the law. Bail is the cash you put up to get out of jail. And it is the guarantee that you're going to return to court for your hearing. So it's saying, instead of me sitting in jail awaiting trial as someone who's presumed innocent, I'm going to give you this money. It's like a deposit. And when I show up to court and I'm adjudicated, then you give me my money back. If you put up all your bail, like in the case of Donald Trump, $200,000, you get all of that back when you show up in court and when you're adjudicated. It's a deposit. You get the whole thing. But if you use a bail bondsman and the bail bondsman posts the bond for you, you give the bail bondsman 10 to 15% of that total amount. So in that case, it would be $20,000 or more. And in some cases, you forfeit a portion of that amount or all of it, depending on how you negotiate with the bail bondsman, and that's the bail bondsman's fee. If you don't show up to court, the bail bondsman is on the hook for all of that money. And that is why we have bounty hunters. You've heard of them before. It's a long-standing law. It predates the United States of America as a country, but basically the bail bondsman has the right to hire someone to say, hey, go get this person who didn't show up to court, because the bail bondsman is on the hook for all the money. And then the bounty hunter is paid a fee for collecting the person who's jumped bail and bringing them back to court. So this is how cash bond works in America, how cash bail works. And in some cases, in some jurisdictions, you're allowed to put up just 10%. So if your bond's $100,000, you can put up $10,000, and the court is sort of fronting you the other $90,000. One more thing is you can put up what's called surety. So sometimes you'll see cash or surety. Surety is collateral. You can essentially sign over the deed to your house and use that as collateral for either the bondsman or directly with the court. You can say, hey, I'm putting up my house, so you'll let me out of jail. A lot of people have pointed out that these bond conditions, even though negotiated, restrict what a current political candidate can do. Remember, Donald Trump isn't just the former president of the United States. He's a current candidate for president of the United States, and he's by far the leading candidate for the GOP nomination. And so for a judge to say, you can't talk on social media about your co-conspirators alleged, the witnesses, the prosecutors, or make threats against the community at large, there are broad exceptions, or should say broad protections for the First Amendment, particularly for political speech. I mean, the First Amendment is the bedrock of our country. You're allowed to say whatever you want so long as it doesn't, endanger the public. There's some other limits. Obviously, there needs to be. You can't go into a bank and say, give me all the money. That's not protected speech. That's a crime because that speech is in the furtherance of a crime. But back to the detail about some people criticizing the judge's order saying Donald Trump cannot use social media to talk about a lot of things about this case, the people in the case, or make any kind of threats, veiled or otherwise. The reason that's in there is because the alternative is holding him as a defendant in jail. And you say, well, that's preposterous. They're not going to hold the former president in jail until trial. There are a lot of people right now who are charged with lesser crimes than the felonies the former president is charged with right now, who are sitting in the Fulton County Jail without a conviction. There's a big difference between jail and prison. Jail is where you await trial or you're sentenced to a year or less incarceration. Prison is where you go when you're sentenced to a year or more of incarceration post-conviction. And this is a really important detail because a lot of people in the jail, in the Fulton County Jail, have not been adjudicated guilty. They're innocent till proven guilty. And the only reason they're there is they either don't have an attorney who can get them out, they can't afford the bond, or they haven't been given bond, or they're just simply awaiting trial because the alternative is bonding out. And, like ankle monitors are a good example. That's a bond condition. Or sometimes the bond conditions say you can't possess weapons or you can't drink. You have to have a clean drug test while you're out on bond. So these bond conditions against Donald Trump, not only are they typical in terms of having some sort of limitations or at least conditions that if they violate those conditions, any defendant, they can then be incarcerated while awaiting trial. This is the alternative to that, which is why his attorneys agreed to it, and presumptively he also agreed to that because it's a consent order. It means the two sides had to come to an agreement, and the judge signed off on it. So that's some file video there of Donald Trump getting off an airplane. This is all just file video right now, but we do expect that Donald Trump will fly here tomorrow. He owns his own 757. Branded with his name on the side, that he will fly into one of the airports here in Metro Atlanta. It's interesting, given that it's a 757, it's not clear whether he may have to fly into Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. But then he will have a Secret Service detail, and there will be a motorcade. It will not be the motorcade we would typically see when he was president, or when the current president, Joe Biden, travels. So what we are not likely to see is what's called a TFR, temporary flight restriction, where helicopters can't be overhead. I've personally flown in the news helicopter when we've had a president in town, and it's miles away that even the news helicopter is required to be kept. We do expect we'll be able to have news chopper coverage of the motorcade. Also, don't expect too many street closures, because it would be more like a rolling motorcade with motorcycles and other police vehicles forward and aft. But this is what's really different than what we see with any other criminal defendant. Most criminal defendants, most people facing multiple felony charges, are brought to the jail in a police car. We are going to see Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, escorted by police cars to jail. And it's just an extraordinary image and something we haven't had to really contemplate in our democracy, at least not in modern times, the idea of a police escort to jail for a former president. But he's not going to be in there very long, as we mentioned. He's going to be fingerprinted. He'll be photographed. There will be indeed be a mugshot. I do have to say the mugshots so far, aesthetically, have been... It really makes you wonder whether the Fulton County Jail is using a camera from the last millennium. The lighting is very poor. The quality of the images is very poor compared to other jurisdictions. But already some of the defendants are sharing their own mugshots. David Schaefer, who is the former GOP chair for the state of Georgia, who's charged as a co-conspirator, and he's also was involved in the so-called fake elector plot, and he is charged with that. He posted his mugshot this morning, and he hashtagged new profile pic. And he also smiled. This started, by the way, back in around the turn of the millennium. I was a reporter in Houston, Texas, and Tom DeLay was a U.S. rep. He wasn't just a congressperson. Let me, if we're going to pop up, let me know when we're going to pop up the picture, and I'll show David Schaefer here for you in a second. So here he is. This is directly off of his tweet. Good morning, new profile picture. That's David Schaefer, and you can see he's got a pretty good smile on his face. You can also see the awful lighting. I mean, like a quarter of his head is missing in the photo. The whole point of mugshots is for the police to have a record of what someone looks like should they go on the lam. While that's not likely in these cases, it's, having an accurate picture is always a good idea. I will tell you, as someone who does lighting professionally for my job here at Atlanta News First, you don't want that kind of lighting. Let's have some just basic even lighting, right? I have a backlight right here. You can see lighting where my hair used to be, and at least some even lighting. Anyhow, it started with Tom DeLay, who was a congressman. He wasn't just a congressman. He was the Senate Majority Leader, and he was accused, he was indicted federally on multiple charges, or indicted on felony charges, I should say. And he posed with a smile on his face, and that's 25 years ago that he posed for those pictures. And now it's kind of become a thing that other politicians do when they pose for a mugshot. They kind of make it look like a yearbook photo. We can pull up John Eastman here. We have a picture of him. This is John Eastman's mugshot. It's a little more, I guess what you would say, a neutral expression. But again, I don't mean to turn this into the, portrait studio critique, but the lighting is just awful. I mean, even just from a practical matter, let's say this was someone with a tattoo on their forehead, and that tattoo was, on the left side of their forehead was a way of finding them if they were to jump bail. We would have no way of knowing what was on this forehead or where the hairline starts or ends, because it's just blown out with this lighting that's what we call oblique lighting. It's just kind of odd. But anyway, back to what you want to know. Let's sort of reset where we are, because I know a lot of you are following this, and if you're watching me right now on whatever device on Atlanta News First Plus, you're probably caught up on what's going on because you're interested in this case. But let's reset for those who sort of joining us in the middle of the Trump investigation. You know that this is all about the 2020 election, but particularly about Georgia. Even though there are cases that are part of this Fulton County indictment that are actually in other jurisdictions. Coffee County, for example. Why does the district attorney in Fulton County have reach all the way to Coffee County? That wouldn't make sense. But that there's also indication of what happened in Michigan and what happened in Pennsylvania and Arizona, what happened in Washington, D.C. How does a Georgia prosecutor, district attorney, have a reach that far? The reason is because of RICO. Under the state RICO charge, the Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations Act here in Georgia, you can actually include elements of a criminal enterprise, alleged criminal enterprise, that occur in other jurisdictions. You can use that as evidence that this criminal enterprise has tendrils all over the place. And that is what Fani Willis is trying to do. And so what Fani Willis is doing is including all of that information, as elements of the crime. Some of these things aren't even crimes, such as the former president's tweets. When Donald Trump was president and he would tweet on Twitter, now called X, those tweets are actually elements. They're called acts in the criminal indictment. But a tweet isn't a crime typically, and it's not alleged to be a crime in these indictments. It's an act in the furtherance of the conspiracy. of the criminal enterprise. That's the allegation. So what we're talking about here is what happened in Georgia primarily in 2020 and in 2021. The Raffensperger call is a big part of that. He was the Secretary of State. Donald Trump and Mark Meadows called him up, and they wanted to find 11,780 votes, which was one more vote than the lead at the time for Joe Biden. The election had already been certified, and there had already been recounts, there was 2 machine hand counts, a hand recount, there were audits, and no matter what, nothing was overturning the election. There were court cases. Governor Kemp, the Republican governor of Georgia, had certified the election and was sending that off to Washington. That call, was in early December, or early January, I should say, before the January 6th meeting of the electors in Washington. That is another big part of this indictment, because you had these electors. It's the Electoral College. The 16 electors cast their ballots as the duly elected electors in the General Assembly, under the Gold Dome of the Capitol here in Atlanta, all for Joe Biden, because Joe Biden won the state, and so his slate of electors becomes the official slate. That was signed by Governor Kemp and sent off to D.C., so that should be the end of it. But there was this alternate slate of electors, because on the same day, December 18th, 2020, David Schaefer and the other electors for Donald Trump's slate also cast ballots, but for Donald Trump, and they certified with their signatures, we are the duly elected electors of the state of Georgia. They then sent those off to the National Archives and to the Senate in Washington, where Mike Pence would open them. And the allegation is that this was part of a grand plot so that Mike Pence had sets of competing electors. Do I trust this slate for Donald Trump or this slate for Joe Biden? I can't tell which one's authentic, therefore I'm not going to count the electors for the state of Georgia. A big part of this allegation is that it's disenfranchising, or an attempt to, the voters of the state of Georgia, because if Mike Pence had gone along with what he was asked to do, what he said he was asked to do, he would have to discount all of the electoral votes for Georgia, or simply overrule the voters of Georgia and pick Donald Trump. And all you have to do if you're on one side or the other of this issue is just take the names out of it or flip the names. Would it be okay if Biden supporters did that and Donald Trump had won Georgia? Would it be okay if they had sort of tried to make the election go the other way? And that's the argument. Of course, the argument of Donald Trump and his supporters is that, no, they were the heroes trying to fight a stolen election. We have found no evidence of that. We have done deep investigations. I personally investigated the dead voters. I knocked on doors of voters who were alleged to have voted dead, according to the Trump campaign, and found them alive. I personally investigated the State Farm Arena video, which was mischaracterized as suitcases of ballots when in fact they were standard ballot containers. What happened to Ruby Freeman and her daughter Shay Moss, who were election workers, where they were volunteers, and then next thing you know, they are facing death threats and had to go into hiding. Those are all elements in all of this, these allegations. So where do we stand now? What we have is 19 people have been indicted. 19 people, including the former president of the United States, for multiple felony offenses, including RICO, which alleges a criminal enterprise with Donald Trump at the head of the criminal enterprise. Whether or not you believe that, whether or not a jury is going to believe that, that is the allegation in the indictment, which is nothing more than an accusation. All 19 defendants are right now presumed innocent. But under our system, the government makes the allegation, and in this case, Fani Willis is the government as the district attorney, and she has made the allegation with a grand jury. So she presented this to a grand jury, first a special grand jury, which recommended charges, and then a sitting Fulton County grand jury, which handed up indictments. And those are the indictments on which these defendants are now turning themselves in to have their day in court. The first thing is they're granted bond so that they're essentially turning themselves into jail and then released. That's what we're seeing right now. This is what's happening right now. And then we're going to see a first appearance in court. The first appearance is an arraignment, which we expect to take place for all 19 defendants on September 5th. There's a shot of the courthouse. That is the Fulton County Courthouse, where we do expect to see those first appearances. I should say arraignments. At those arraignments, a plea would typically be entered. And now either the defendant enters the plea or their defense attorney would enter pleas of guilty or not guilty. We expect not guilty pleas. And then that starts the whole trial process. There's pretrial motions, discovery motions, and this can take some time. But Fani Willis has indicated her intention to move quickly. And there's a no-nonsense judge, Judge McAfee, who was appointed by Governor Kemp and is also running to be elected by the people of the county to keep that seat in court. It's important to point out that Mark Meadows, the former chief of staff for the White House, he has filed a motion with the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia in order to have his case moved to federal court. Now, and we also expect a similar motion to be filed by the former President Donald Trump. And the statute under which they're doing this essentially involves that they were federal officers. And so that Mark Meadows is arguing everything he did was as chief of staff, not as a member of the campaign. So go back to the Raffensperger call. Mark Meadows wasn't on there, he would argue, as a representative of the Trump campaign. He was on that call as the chief of staff for the White House. And so he is arguing that making calls and arranging things and logistics for the President of the United States, who was investigating what he believed to be voter fraud, that is part of his job as a federal officer, and therefore he's entitled to immunity, but at the very least he says he's entitled to a hearing, rather to have his whole case heard in front of a federal judge for the Northern District of Georgia in the U.S. District Court. Why does that matter? The biggest reason is the jury pool. So you would have a broader jury pool. It's not all of North Georgia, but it is a much broader cross-section of the district, of the Northern District of Georgia. So rather than just drawing from Fulton County, which went for Joe Biden in the last election, you would have exurbs and suburbs that skew more Republican, and so you would have a better chance at a broader jury pool. But we still could see this prosecuted, even if it goes to federal court, in front or prosecuted by Fani Willis and her office in federal court, and there still would be state charges. So this doesn't open up a federal pardon. It's not as though the state RICO charge suddenly becomes a federal RICO charge if that happens. Now, the counter argument to all of this is that there is nothing in the job description for a federal officer, or particularly the White House chief of staff, that you're supposed to go around committing crimes with your boss, the President of the United States. I'm not saying there were crimes. I'm saying that's the allegation. That's the indictment, is that Mark Meadows was a criminal co-conspirator with his boss, the President of the United States. If your boss gives you an unlawful order and then you go out and carry that out and commit that crime, is that part of your job description as a federal officer? These are the arguments the federal judge needs to hear. The motion is already filed with the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. What Mark Meadows has additionally done is filed an emergency motion to either immediately grant his motion without argument, without a hearing, because he has until noon tomorrow to turn himself in, or he wants an order from the federal judge prohibiting the county district attorney from arresting him, because that's what she said she's going to do. His lawyers asked for an extension, and Fani Willis said, we're not granting extensions. We're treating this like any other case. And she's already given them essentially 2 weeks to turn themselves in, nearly 2 weeks. And if 2 weeks isn't good enough, hey, the jail's open 24/7, and we're available to negotiate these consent orders for bond. And if you're not ready, we're going to issue arrest warrants. The arrest warrants were already issued by the grand jury. That is standard. So the grand jury, essentially, it's the grand jury's authority under which the arrest warrants are issued, and with the presiding judge over the grand jury, the authority of that judge as well. But those arrest warrants aren't active in so much as, if one of these defendants gets pulled over, do they run their name and see an arrest warrant? Yes, they would see it in GCIC, the Georgia Crime Information Center computer, and they may make an arrest on that warrant and bring them to the jail. But otherwise, nobody's out looking for them right now. There aren't marshals or sheriff's deputies going around knocking on doors trying to find these defendants. Mark Meadows is out of state, which is another issue. If he doesn't turn himself in at noon tomorrow and there is no order from the federal court, do we have some sort of an extradition situation? Do we, already Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said he would not. He said before these indictments came down that, or were handed up, that he would not send Florida Department of Public Safety, or FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement officers, to go get the former president Mar-a-Lago and extradite him to Georgia. That is not going to be an issue because Donald Trump is expected to turn himself in. We're hearing sometime tomorrow late afternoon or evening. He's saying sometime Thursday, and that's when he will be technically arrested and actually arrested, but essentially he won't be put in handcuffs, we're told, and he'll be immediately released on that bond. So that's where we stand right now. That's the situation that we're covering. But we are also doing ongoing, continuing coverage on Atlanta News First Plus. We are all over this story with a team of anchors, reporters, photographers, editors, digital producers, and we are all on top of this. And Joy Nakrin is going to be joining you here momentarily, and we're going to be sort of looking at more of the legal issues. So I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TV. I don't have a JD. I just sort of opine based on my 33 years experience spending a lot of time in court and picking this up through osmosis. But you're about to hear from a genuine attorney, Joy Nakrin, who's also joined by legal experts to sort of look at the broader and more specific legal issues. And so I'll turn it over to Joy.
Brandon, you're too self-effacing. I think you have an honorary JD. You could probably have an honorary JD from pretty much any law school you want at this point. But thanks so much for being with us. I'm Joy Nakrin here with a special guest that we have joining us today. This is attorney Josh Schiffer. Josh, we're so honored to have you.
Thank you.
So Josh does a lot of analysis for numerous networks, including Court TV, which is where we met, when I was working over there as a legal correspondent. But we're really lucky to have Josh because, Josh, you argue in many cases in the Fulton County Courthouse. You deal with the people at the Rice Street Jail all the time. Here in Fulton County, you know about the ins and outs. It's your daily routine. So
I joke with people, it's kind of the home away from home. When I decided to buy my house, being close enough to Rice Street to make it convenient was literally something we considered. This is part of our daily life because when you work in a criminal context, you're going to be facilitating with these large organizations daily, weekly, and it's the little details that are really the hardest and most important. It's knowing how the little processes work while also being able to understand why the jail functions the way that it does, especially in conjunction with the courts, because this is the largest and busiest jurisdiction in the entire state of Georgia. This is a massive operation that runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Our Sheriff Pat Labatt was very clear. It's open. They're ready, no matter what, 24 hours a day to handle any kind of big case.
Yeah, and we have a live image here of the jail where former Trump attorney and former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani is expected to surrender. And of course, all of the 19 defendants in this sweeping alleged election interference case are actually required to surrender by noon on Friday. But we've already seen at least half a dozen of them surrender, and of course many more reach bond agreements as well. Among one of the more high-profile defendants to surrender is the former Republican Party chair, David Schaefer. And then again, we're expecting the man once known as America's mayor, Rudy Giuliani, to surrender. And we're just kind of keeping our eyes open for that. Josh, how will that process work? Because we are talking about someone who is so high profile. And we have been told that, these defendants are going to be treated like any other defendants. Is that exactly true?
I was actually going to point that out when you were showing that footage of live at the Fulton County Courthouse right now. That view that you just had up on screen, that's the secret back door that a number of us have been talking about. The main Fulton County entrance. Yep, that's the image right there. There's a back entrance. That entrance is used for service and deliveries, and the most important delivery for jails, police officers dropping off inmates. That leads directly to the back end of the jail where new intake was constructed several years ago. When the Fulton County Jail was originally opened, the intake facilities were already overloaded. In fact, the whole jail was. It was out of date basically the day it opened. So this back entrance is where, if you have been placed under arrest, you're going to come in through this back entrance. It's not where the vast majority of people facilitating with the jail are going to enter the facility, and that shows how these individuals are being treated differently. This is not where people are normally supposed to show up to get processed. Obviously, they've made some additional arrangements with Sheriff Pat Labatt's office to prevent the free view of people, high-profile individuals involved in the Trump 19 case, from being photographed and videoed walking into the jail, images that a lot of America is very interested in seeing. We're not going to see Rudy Giuliani put his hand on the door and open it up or anything like that. They've very carefully managed the media in the processing system. So that's definitely a little bit different than any way that my clients get treated or that you would get treated. Doesn't mean that once you're in, it's necessarily that much more comfortable. However, I will note every one of these individuals has been checking in, getting processed, and checking out of the jail at a ludicrously fast speed compared to anybody else.
Yeah.
If you've ever felt like you were going to be important, go to a jail and wait through processing. You're about the least important person in the world because they've got lots of duties, lots of things going on. There's an enormous amount of sitting around and waiting without any information. Clearly, that did not happen to anyone who's been booked in so far. Some of these book-in turnarounds, such as Mr. Eastman, who was about the first, or Mr. Cheeseborough, an hour and a half. That is lightning quick, reflects the stresses that are placed on the jail by having to handle these issues. And I'm going to note, just from my own personal knowledge, the rest of the jail is still functioning, but it's not functioning the way that it normally would. I have clients that are being delayed, and I'm going to ascribe that to the stress that the jail's in right now with these high-profile individuals. Other people might not be getting processed properly due to the high profile involved in the Trump 19 case. Rudy Giuliani showing up today, obviously one of the biggest names and stories involved. I still also hold out that little bit of wonder with the debate coming up and Donald Trump's mastery of the public message, mastery of being able to dominate conversations. If he really wanted to pull a boss move, he could just pop in there anytime he wants and steal all the air from every other story, especially that big debate tonight in Milwaukee.
Exactly, and he's not, expected to actually participate in that debate since he's already leading in the polls, and he's kind of busy with some other things that we've been covering. But ahead of all this, I want to ask you, you're talking a little bit about the unique treatment that these defendants are getting, and many argue that even though there are claims that from both sides that they're being treated just like any other defendants, many critics say they're really not. Many critics say, look, anyone else who is brought in on RICO charges in Fulton County does not get bond. For instance, in the YSL case, most of the defendants didn't get bond, right? And here, their bond agreement's already been reached for, at this point, most of the defendants. And if they haven't been reached already, is that in itself kind of a distinguishing factor?
I'm very much questioning the ones that haven't had bonds already determined. We're getting kind of close to the end of this Friday noon deadline, even though it's only Wednesday. Time works differently in the court system. Slow things are fast and fast things are slow the moment you put a judge involved. So I am surprised we haven't seen the full list of everybody. I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen bonds for everybody. I imagine we're going to see that by the end of the night, because these people have got to get moving if they're going to get turned in, processed, and released with the benefits that I believe Fonnie Willis's office has asked the sheriff's office to provide. And that is hand walking people through this process, setting them, segregating them, cleaving them from the rest of the individuals, the rest of the citizens who are being processed like normal. Generally, if you're going to be arrested at Fulton County, either with a soft turn-in, where you're literally showing up and saying, I'm here, there's a warrant, please process me, or if you're being arrested by a police officer on a charge where you're going to get a quick, easy bond, it's a 12-hour process. It's a 24-hour process. I have a client who was granted a bond on Monday in open court. They're still not bonded out, even though they posted the bond immediately. And that's just processing someone to get out of the jail. You will be treated differently if you are not a super high-profile individual. But I will also give a lot of credit to DA Willis, as well as the Sheriff Pat Labatt, in trying to make this as consistent and regular as any other individual would be treated.
Yeah, and when we're talking about the bond, I have so far 13 of the 19 defendants have reached bond agreements. Of course, most notably the former president, a $200,000 bond. John Eastman, former attorney, $100,000. I'm just kind of pulling out some of the, Sidney Powell also, I believe it was $100,000 for her bond as well. Again, another former Trump attorney. Kenneth Chesebro, again, $100,000. So Rudy Giuliani, also a former Trump attorney in this case, but facing more counts than some of the others here in this indictment. Certainly RICO, all 19 defendants are charged in this racketeering scheme. And Rudy Giuliani also charged with numerous counts of conspiracy, false statements, solicitation. But I want to ask you specifically about the RICO charges. We've talked a little bit about that in terms of the bond aspect here. But it's a very unique discussion when it concerns Rudy Giuliani in particular, because part of the way that he made his name in New York was kind of breaking up the mob, the New York City mob, using racketeering laws at the time. And now he is being prosecuted, or has been indicted on racketeering charges. I can see you already have it. You already want to react.
The irony. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I love our Constitution. The only reason that prosecutors are good is because they have good defense attorneys. Both parties are necessary for our system to work. And Rudy Giuliani ran one of the most aggressive and successful U.S. attorneys' offices in our nation's history. He used the RICO laws that were at his disposal in brand new and creative ways in order to take down the largest known organized crime groups. These are the mobsters that we all grow up and hear about and think about in movies and entertainment. Rudy Giuliani went after the real guys using these exact same laws. He knows their power and effect better than anyone. It's arguably why he's probably pretty frightened, because he knows how powerful the argument is in both the law and in front of juries in telling these conspiracy racketeering stories. It's going to be a very tough road for him. A lot of people are concerned with his age and well-being and health, considering how much he has kind of thrown himself into being the president's most prominent protector as a lawyer and as a consultant.
Really interesting, also another point of discussion when it comes to Rudy Giuliani, who's expected to surrender today, is the fact that he's an attorney who also has spoken out now, just, in this time leading up to his surrender, about the fact that there are numerous attorneys who are indicted here. And I don't know if you heard the comments, Josh, that he made earlier, just saying, basically that it's pretty unheard of to go after attorneys in this way. And he felt that it was sort of an attack on his right to counsel in some sense, and on the former president's right to counsel. What do you think of that?
It's absolutely a valid criticism of these charges. Lawyers are professionals. We are barred by state agencies. We are thoroughly vetted, tested, tracked. There's a lot of stuff that the state can do once you are a professional registered with them, and you're subject to their discipline even outside the regular court system. That's why including the lawyers as alleged criminals specifically linked to the advice they gave and the work product they provided to their clients, it kind of jumps into a new territory. Traditionally, people have been able to point to their lawyers and say, hey, I'm not guilty. I was just following my lawyer's advice. And that's been tried so many times. There's extensive appellate decisions specifically relating to that good faith defense of I listened to my lawyer. But lawyers are going to be held to the same standards as all citizens, and if not more and higher standards due to their knowledge of these complex issues. Judges, prosecutors, they're going to be easily more aggressive with people who should have known better. You can, with a straight face, turn around and talk about truth and falsity and how the system works as a layperson and have a lot of consideration and authenticity. You can't do that as a lawyer. You can't close your eyes and stick your fingers in your ears and say, no, 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 I didn't know that was going to be illegal, or I didn't know that was true or false. Once you are a lawyer, you can't take that hat off. It's on 24 hours a day until you're no longer a lawyer. These individuals have exposed themselves by providing what we expect to see in the evidence as wrongful, fraudulent, inappropriate advice and guidance to such a degree that now Fonnie Willis is saying they are actually part of this conspiracy, mandatory, necessary, included as defendants, and she's going to put pressure on them. Those lawyers are now trapped between their duties to their clients and their own self-preservation. That brings in a whole nother series of discussions that we're going to watch the courts wrestle with as this case progresses.
I'm just looking at some of our viewer comments on YouTube here, and that I just wanted to share. So one person, I guess her name is Chappie, they say it's pretty well known the Atlanta prison is pretty terrible with booking in general, and if it didn't take hours, they wouldn't be getting special treatment. Is that a fair point?
That's very fair, and I've heard it from lawyers all morning. Started yesterday with messages. My clients have never gotten out that fast. Wow, wonder what it would be like if these clients were not generally middle-aged or older white men. There's a lot of very real criticism that these individuals, by being processed in the manner that they are specifically being treated differently. And that's offensive. It is.
And we see a lot of YouTube discussion on our YouTube channel about that. But we also see a lot of discussion that I'm not going to repeat here because it's not appropriate. Things are getting pretty heated. But, people have strong emotions when it comes to this, strong opinions.
And that's a really important part of this that I really hope everybody understands. Our institutions are meant to be tested and stressed. This is part of that. How we go through and recover, that's the promise of America, and we're going to be great. It's just going to be tough in the meantime.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so, we're counting down to the surrender of Rudy Giuliani. Like I've been showing this live image of the Fulton County Jail where he is expected to surrender. We do know that he is in the Atlanta area. We captured some video earlier today of his plane landing in DeKalb, but not sure. What do you think he might be doing right now? Probably sorting things out with his attorneys and his team, figuring out the great game plan.
I kind of think that they're meeting, just doing the check-in with, hey, Rudy, if I reverse roles with them, I'm saying, hey, Mr. Giuliani, I'm here. I'm your lawyer. We're going to hand walk you through this. We have already made contact with the sheriff's department. We have a liaison in the inside in order to ensure that you remain safe. Because remember, the sheriff's office has a strong requirement to keep everybody in their custody safe. The higher profile individuals pose a unique security threat, and the sheriff can't ignore that. So there is a very good argument that by treating these high-profile individuals in the most efficient manner possible, he's actually serving the entirety of the system by reducing the distraction. But I'm going to sit down with Mr. Giuliani, if I'm his lawyer, and tell him what I expect to happen over the process, and that is we're going to drive in through the back gate. We're going to drop off at intake. We're going to go inside. You're going to sit and fill out a couple of documents, answer some questions, be biometrically identified. You're going to fill out some other stuff and sit for a few minutes, have your picture taken, do the basic medical evaluation. And then once all that information has been obtained, it will be verified and double-checked by some supervisors from within the sheriff's office. And then as soon as it's complete, he's going to walk out that back door, and the jail will be happy another high-profile individual is no longer behind bars. Having these individuals go through the Fulton County Jail is an enormous stress on a facility that already struggles on the best of days, because it is that frightening, scary, and difficult. This is a facility that's been under federal monitoring, management, and control for virtually my entire career. And it is a regular scene of some horrific, sad civil rights violations, of which we follow regularly. But the sheriff has a tough job. He knows about it, and he works really hard to do it the best he can.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, of course, we're still waiting for Rudy Giuliani to surrender, but the big defendant here, the biggest defendant here, I mean, there are numerous big defendants, of course, is the former president himself, right? Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
It's going to be fascinating. So we're all sitting here pondering what we would do if we were advising the president. And the president has some extraordinarily experienced and professional lawyers on his team that have gameplayed this many ways, considering what impact this process is going to have. The president, former president, has a lot of authority in choosing how he wants to accomplish this turn-in. He's told everybody Thursday. That more than satisfies the Friday by noon. But what if President Trump wants to magnify or increase the impact of him turning himself in? And let's all remember, no one has been better traditionally and historically at maximizing messaging impact, controlling a narrative, than President Trump. It is his calling card.
Speaking of that, I have a really interesting viewer comment I just want to share with you. So there's somebody, Apache Mimi, saying, your lawyers go pro se, televise the proceedings, LOL. So go pro se, meaning why don't they represent themselves? Rudy Giuliani's a lawyer, John Eastman's a lawyer, Sidney Powell is a lawyer. These are some of the most high profile lawyers in America. What would you say as a lawyer?
It's a legitimate defense. My opinion is one of the strongest defenses that any of these defendants can make is by putting our prosecutorial system on trial. It's indefensibly politicized, our criminal system. Now, the criminal system has to deal with crimes. Fani Willis is 100% right. A crime occurs in her jurisdiction. It's her mandate and requirement to go prosecute those crimes, but she gets to use her discretion. Seeing how this is all going to happen, if I am accused or if I'm representing an accused, there's a distinct value optically and in front of a jury and for the process to represent yourself. Not necessarily wise, but it throws a huge wrench in an already complex process. There are questions about what kind of lawyers want to get involved in these cases. A lot of discussion amongst the criminal bar over whether firms would even be willing to accept representing some of these individuals, considering the length of time likely included in any representation or retainer. It's absolutely conceivable that these cases will still be getting appealed, worked on, and litigated 3, 4, 5, 6 years from now. That's not unheard of with complex criminal matters. And it could be thousands of hours of attorney work product for each one of these 19 defendants, because a zealous defense can be huge. If you're going to get and present the most zealous defense, you're going to be filing stuff left, right, and center when confronted with novel legal issues, of which there are hundreds in this prosecution. We're just starting off right now with the federal removal that we've all been talking about. Should this case be taken away from the Fulton County Superior Court bench and placed with a federal judge, Steve Jones, who has been the judge? Mark Meadows is moving for that aggressively right now. There are hearings scheduled and responses due. Big question is, what would Fani Willis prefer? She wants to be in her home court of Fulton County, but what kind of difference or impact would moving the trial down the street to Steve Jones, a federal Article III judge, what impact would that have? A lot of us think there wouldn't be that big an impact. Judge Jones, deeply experienced, very, very good judge, knows all the rules. And what happens with a removal of this case is it would be tried using state court rules, state court laws, It would just be in the federal court. Doesn't change the pardon issue at all. It remains a state court case, but the statute ensures that a federal system will handle that state court case in order to insulate the defendants from potential political manipulation from the Fulton County bench. We've also got who is Judge McAfee, the youngest and newest and most unknown of all the members of the Fulton County bench. He has been a sitting judge for about 6 months, and despite extensive experience prosecuting for Barrow County, prosecuting in Fulton County, prosecuting as a U.S. attorney, and running the Office of the Inspector General for the state of Georgia, there are big questions about his level of experience running trials. Running trials is hard. Even the best judges would struggle with a case of this size, magnitude, and complexity, let alone someone who's basically kind of new on the bench. And those issues can be exploited and extrapolated down into a huge number of problems incoming that would slow down a process that Fani Willis wants to be discreet, small, and efficient. So there may be justifications to actually move this to federal court, and I look forward to her response.
Yeah, and and I want to point out, Mark Meadows not only filed a motion or had his team file a motion to have his case moved to federal court, but he also just recently, it was actually yesterday, filed a request to have the arrest blocked, basically, so that he could avoid arrest here in Georgia. What do you think we're going to see on that? What does that mean for all this?
Absolutely unique. We all applauded around the criminal defense bar because of the creativity involved. For those of you that are just kind of catching up with this, Mark Meadows basically asked a federal court to stay all of Fani Willis's actions in having him be arrested and turned in until a federal court can hear some of his claims, specifically immunity from prosecution, the removal issue, and by asking for a restraining order or protective order, he's basically asked the federal government to tell Fulton County and Pat Labatt they can't arrest Mark Meadows. That is an aggressive, unique, and creative argument. I think it's going to die on the vine very quickly, as long with most other criminal defense attorneys, because otherwise we would see this tactic a lot more. He also used some interesting language, or his lawyers did, about the convenience and the struggle getting there and getting to Atlanta and processing. That landed like a ton of bricks. Judges don't care that it's hard to get here to go to jail.
Right.
They love sending their personal badged and armed assistants to help you get to jail, and have no qualms doing that immediately.
Oh, yeah.
Really got to question how in touch Mark Meadows' lawyers were in making that request in the first place.
I'm just pointing our viewers to the story on this on AtlantaNewsFirst.com if you want to read about the Mark Meadows element of all this. But I mean, again, just go on that Trump investigation tab right there at the top, and you can, it just helps you sort out everything, because there's so much here.
Well, and that's going to be one of the struggles with this story. There are 19 individuals, each with individual legal arguments in just this case. And then these individuals obviously relate to the prosecutions in other jurisdictions, and what they say in one jurisdiction carries over to another. So an issue that's been raised now is David Schaefer's statements regarding how he was instructed. And these are formal filings. And if you're filing it and it's a statement you made, it's an admission. It can be admitted in multiple other courts because it's your statement. Conflicts within some of these statements are really causing a lot of people to pause, reconsider, and potentially expose individuals to additional charges. If the defense of one defendant accuses another defendant of additional crimes, the state can always choose to add crimes through a superseding indictment, and we may just be seeing that unfold in front of us.
And do you expect to see a lot of that happening with this case, defendants pointing fingers at each other?
Absolutely. That is how RICO is basically designed to encourage people at the lower end of any conspiracy to flip up the chain. Same with a basic drug organization. It's the same theory. The people at the bottom have a lot of risk and not a lot of attachment to the people at the top. People at the top may have backstabbed them or not supported them or given them bad advice or betrayed them in some way. So there's no love lost at the bottom, and they have a lot of incentive to go to the state and say, hey, state, we will tell you whatever you want to know. We'll be honest. Just promise to dismiss our case or give us gentle treatment. We're going to see a lot of that from the lower end. We've already seen that in who was indicted in the first place. A number of the 30-odd unindicted co-conspirators absolutely could have been indicted, absolutely could have been forced to go through this criminal process. But because of their actions prior to indictment, they've been able to avoid criminal charges, most likely through cooperations.
It's so fascinating because we're talking about such high-profile individuals. I mean, it's fascinating for a number of reasons, but that's one of them. I want to ask you, because I've had people ask me, so if Trump is convicted and if Trump is serving prison time, or whether or not he's serving prison time, wonder if he can actually do the job of president. Is there any law, is there anything that, I mean, logistically it might be difficult from prison.
A conviction would not prohibit him from standing. There is this whole 14th Amendment issue about disqualification that Judge Ludwig and some other very prominent thought leaders on the right side of the spectrum have raised as prohibiting Donald Trump from ever being president again. But that's not present in this case. That's going to get decided by other judges, other lawyers, and it's going to be quite an argument there. But when it comes to just the Fulton County charges, if Donald Trump was convicted and sentenced, he would absolutely still be able to run for president, be elected, and in the way our world works, you could run the country, theoretically, from a jail or prison. I think that that's very unlikely, and bluntly, when it comes to sentence considerations, that's going to be a great discussion, because President Trump and other people's culpability, as shown in trial, feeds into any sentence determinations, and there are lots of very strong arguments of all he was doing was trying to save his job and trying to get people to believe the way that he believed, and that's First Amendment. It's a real argument. The state's struggle in this case is not just showing that he was asking people to support him, that he was relying on information later determined by other people to be false. The state basically has to prove that Donald Trump knew he was lying and knew that he was defrauding people while asking them to make or to take efforts and take actions in furtherance of the alleged conspiracy.
Josh Schiffer, we really appreciate you bringing in your, not just your knowledge of the law, but your knowledge of the court system and the jail system, the booking process right here in Fulton County. I just want to let our viewers know that we're going to keep our eyes on the Fulton County Jail as we expect former Trump attorney, former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani to surrender himself at any moment now. I also want to let our viewers know that our political reporter Doug Reardon is keeping an eye on the latest with this story and everything related to the Georgia indictments surrounding the alleged election interference. Keep it right here on Atlanta News First, Atlanta News First Plus, atlantanewsfirst.com. Download our free mobile news app as well to get updates sent right to your phone. We're staying on this. Stay with us.
All right, everybody, this is Maria Moreau joining you here with our continuing coverage of the indictments out of Georgia, former President Donald Trump, as well as 18 others. Today, the big name Rudy Giuliani landed in Atlanta, specifically at DeKalb Airport, and we are still waiting for his surrender and the details to come out of that. But as you saw just there, our political reporter Doug Reardon, who I'm pulling up here in a moment, we'll be talking to him. He's really our man on the ground. He's been right outside of this jail all morning long, out in the field all week long, just since the news of the indictment first came down. Doug's been out there with us. I want to take you out to Doug right now, who you can see. Doug, thanks for joining us here on Atlanta News First Plus. I really wanted to bring you on because you have the on-the-ground perspective of all of this. You've been up close. You've been seeing some of all of this unfold. Standing outside this jail today, I understand there's heightened security, a lot of measures being taken. What is the energy out there?
Is the public entrance to the jail, which you can probably see right over my shoulder. That is blocked off with police cars. If you go across the complex to Jefferson Street, which is the actual intake entrance for the jail, there are crews set up all up and down that street as well. So it is a bit chaotic. There's a lot of people here, a lot of reporters, a lot of photographers. And in fact, today it was the first day where we saw some supporters and some opponents of former President Trump and some of these other 18 individuals charged in this case come out here to kind of see what the deal was, what was going on, and to partake in some of the activity as well. But again, this is largely a reporter and a photographer presence here, media presence along Rice Street as we await the arrival of Rudy Giuliani, the former attorney for former President Donald Trump, and also the former attorney, the former mayor of New York, who once held the moniker America's Mayor. And so this is quite a turn of events for him. And in fact, what is ironic about him being here today is the fact that he's facing over a dozen charges in a racketeering case, a RICO indictment. And that is exactly what he made himself famous for as a prosecutor in New York City, was prosecuting organized crime, mafia cases against RICO-influenced organizations. And so a bit of irony here for Rudy Giuliani to be showing up to Fulton County to be booked, processed, have his mugshot taken, just like we've seen with about a dozen other of these defendants in this case do over the last couple of days. The way it's kind of worked is, and we've spent, as you mentioned, a lot of time outside of the Fulton County Courthouse as well, but we've seen a lot of these teams' attorneys go in and negotiate bond agreements and surrender agreements for them to come here to the jail to be booked and processed in a speedy manner. And in fact, maybe not an hour or two ago, our crews over there at the Fulton County Courthouse actually saw Giuliani's attorney team go into the courthouse, again, presumably to negotiate some sort of bond agreement or some sort of surrender deal with the district attorney's team who is prosecuting this case. And so we do expect after that takes place that he will be here either at this entrance on Rice Street or over at the intake entrance on Jefferson Street to go through this process that, again, we've seen a good handful of these defendants do over the last couple of days. Now, again, the big news, and what I think everybody is waiting on and why it could be a very tense situation between today and tomorrow, is former President Donald Trump himself to show up here to surrender to authorities. And just like the others who have done so over the last couple of days, get booked, get processed, have their mugshots taken, and perhaps even enter a plea of some sort. We know that that is something that some of these defendants have done. Of course, they have the right to waive their preliminary hearing, their first appearance before a judge, and simply enter a plea at some time during this process. And so we don't know what Giuliani will do once he actually gets here as far as entering a plea or what his bond could be. As I understand it, that is exactly what his attorneys are discussing with the DA's team at the Fulton County Courthouse right now. And so it's really just a waiting game. We've seen a lot of cars come in and out of the jail complex. They're still conducting business. No media is allowed back in that parking lot in front of the jail. We're kind of relegated to the other side of the street here just to watch cars come and go, but business is ongoing here at the jail, and so it'll really just be kind of a guessing game as to when he shows up here. But I can tell you that we do have crews out at the courthouse, and we have eyes watching the movements of these attorneys, and so we should be able to let you know pretty shortly, I would hope, when he might be able to actually be here at the jail, Maria.
And we are starting to see some YouTube comments coming in. I want to thank everyone for their patience as we had some initial audio issues there, but we were able to hear you for the most part. Some people saying hashtag where's Rudy? That's the big question for everyone right now. Where's Rudy? He's a big name up there of the 19 indicted, and really the beginning of what's going to be something that the nation is watching. I mean, the surrender of former President Donald Trump in Fulton County, that's anticipated tomorrow. He's already said he's planning on surrendering tomorrow. With the anticipated arrival of Rudy Giuliani and then former President Donald Trump, are we going to see some sort of difference in that booking arrest process, or is it in line with what the sheriff said? Is that anticipated to be the same? Have you learned anything from talking with them?
You know, I think it'll be very similar for all these defendants, and we can just harken back to what Fulton County Sheriff Pat Labat said a couple weeks ago when we asked him, what will this process be like? Will there be any special treatment given? And he essentially said, no, not at all. We just view these as defendants, as part of the Fulton County justice system, and they will come in, they will be fingerprinted, they will go through the very same intake processes as any other defendant. Now, the difference, if anything, for these 19 defendants versus anyone else facing a crime here in Fulton County is that element of being able to negotiate their bond amounts and their surrender agreements beforehand with the district attorney's office. And that's simply by nature of the fact that this is a high-profile case. These are some high-profile defendants. A lot of people know Rudy Giuliani, obviously former President Donald Trump, former GOP chair David Schaefer, Sidney Powell, big names who have been part of this election conversation for the last couple of years. And so beyond that, though, there really won't be much of a difference in terms of the actual process. Like we said, they're going to go in there. Sheriff Labat said during the press conference a couple weeks ago when we asked that they absolutely will have their mugshots taken. That is something that we haven't seen out of the former president's cases in New York. It's not something we saw in Miami. It's not something we will see in D.C. So this will be the only mugshot, presumably, of the former president and these 18 others that will come out of any cases that they are involved in. But no, for the most part, they are going to be treated the same as any other defendant. And just to answer everyone's questions from the comments there that you just read, we know that Rudy Giuliani is on the ground here in Atlanta. I can't tell you exactly where he is right now. I would assume probably pretty close to his lawyers, who we know are at the Fulton County Courthouse. But we did have video of him leaving New York this morning. We did have video of him on the ground and off the plane at the Cap Peachtree Airport, not too far away from here, a couple hours ago. And so we know he is here. We know his attorneys are doing some work with the DA's team right now. Again, it could be a bond amount. It could be some sort of surrender agreement. But we can pretty much expect him to be here at some point throughout sometime this afternoon.
And Doug, you know, we appreciate having you provide us this insight. I know this is something that you've been following. We've had team coverage on this for more than a week now. I gotta ask, you know, this is such an unprecedented, arguably a historical moment. Not arguably, it is a historical moment. You having your political background, being a journalist here in Atlanta and Fulton County, how is covering this for you, for so many of you that are out there, you know, just witnessing this firsthand and then reporting back to us, bringing us into this front row seats to a former president being indicted on criminal charges like these?
Right. Well, I can tell you for one that it's hot, just to lay the land for you here. I mean, everyone is outside. Nobody is waiting in their cars because, again, this is the type of thing where you don't want to skip a beat and miss something. It happens so quickly, and we have such little information before these things take place, such as attorneys going to the courthouse and coming here to the Fulton County Jail to be booked. So everyone is very much on edge. But as you mentioned, not overlooking at all the historical nature of this, it is so rare and really without any precedent at all for this type of thing to happen, for some of these names, especially former President Donald Trump, to come and, I mean, my goodness, have a mugshot taken of somebody who served in the Oval Office. I think nobody here that is going over their heads, nobody here is taking for granted the historical nature of what is happening right here in Fulton County and the city of Atlanta. Certainly, it's been, searching for the right word, it has been a whirlwind to try and keep up with all of the developments. We know that every single day, almost by the hour, something new is happening, and so people are glued to their phones, they're glued to their laptops, and everyone is talking here, exchanging information, just trying to make heads and tails of what is going on hour by hour, and in very much some cases minute by minute.
Doug Reardon, our political reporter outside of Fulton County Jail, where we're anticipating the surrender of Rudy Giuliani. Thank you so much. And of course, we'll check in with you on our afternoon and evening newscast starting at 3 o'clock. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks, Maria.
All right, I want to talk a little bit about the next steps. You know, the surrender of former President Donald Trump anticipated tomorrow. Rudy Giuliani's surrender anticipated today, and we've seen so many other characters. Excuse me, let me bring Doug's audio down. There we go. So many other names in this indictment, so many of those people, John Eastman, already surrendering, reaching their bond agreements. As we get more into the next steps for the 2024 election, for voters like you and for former President Donald Trump, I want to toss it to our digital producer and politics man in our very own newsroom, Tim Darnell, as he talked to some experts on what we can expect the implications and consequences to be in this and how this is all going to affect the voter. This is the latest installment of Political Update.
Former President Donald Trump is set to surrender himself at the Fulton County Jail on Thursday of this week after last week's historic sweeping indictment of the former president and 18 of his Republican allies who are alleged to have attempted to overturn Georgia's 2020 presidential election, and we are continuing to follow all of these fast-moving and fast-breaking developments here at Atlanta News First. Welcome to this week's Political Update. I'm Tim Darnell, and here are some of the headlines that we're following as we speak. They tend to be breaking by the minute and by the hour, but here's where we stand so far. As I said earlier, the former president is set to surrender himself to authorities at the Fulton County Jail on Thursday. This is following a series of bond settlements and arrangements that were reached Monday and Tuesday for the former president and some of his Republican allies. Bond settlements mean that the amount of bond is agreed upon by the Fulton County District Attorney and the respective defendants' attorneys to determine how much each individual co-defendant in this sweeping indictment will pay in order to be released on their own, possibly released on their own recognizance. On Tuesday, the first of the co-defendants began surrendering themselves at the Fulton County Jail for booking and officially having their mug shot taken. On Tuesday, Scott Hall, an Atlanta area bail bondsman who was allegedly involved in attempting to breach the election database in the South Georgia county of Coffee County, was the first to surrender. He was followed later Tuesday morning by Trump attorney John Eastman, whose bond was set at $100,000. The former president's bond has been set at $200,000. The majority, or I should say $80,000 of that bond amount, refers to the various RICO charges that the former president is facing from Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis. All of these developments are happening very quickly, and we are on the ground outside the Fulton County Courthouse to bring you all of the latest developments and latest news in terms of these sweeping indictments in Fulton County as Atlanta continues to be the center of the nation's political attention. Donald Trump, as we all know, is facing a number of challenges on the legal front in New York, Miami, Washington, D.C., and now here in Atlanta. It's the first time in American history that a former president is running to recapture the White House, at the same time facing a whole host of legal challenges from New York all the way to Miami and a few stops in between. I recently had a conversation with Professor Glenn Smith of the University of North Georgia, whose campus is spread across 5 North Georgia communities, and he had some very enlightening comments in terms of how all of the former presidents' indictments are affecting his chances in next year's political election. Joined by Professor John Acevedo, who is a visiting associate professor at Emory Law School. And Professor, we're seeing, as you and I are having this conversation right now, we're seeing a number of bond agreements and bond settlements coming out of the Fulton County Courthouse former President Donald Trump, his Atlanta-based attorneys, and we presume the former president himself have agreed to a $200,000 bond agreement. We have another bond agreement set for one of his former attorneys, John Eastman, and several others of varying amount. Tell us what a bond agreement actually is.
Sure. So a bond agreement, often done when a defendant's going to surrender, self-surrender, as opposed to someone picked up on an arrest warrant. So that's the main differentiation. And this is really meant to streamline the process. So almost everyone who's going to surrender here in Georgia will have a bond agreement in place if possible. And the reason for that is they don't have to then wait to go before a magistrate judge to have their bail bond set. So here it's preset, there's a preset amount. The defendants will still have to show up in Atlanta, in Fulton County, to go through the booking process, but they now know that they will have a bond, what that bond looks like, and hopefully, from their perspective, that it's pre-approved by the judge.
And that leads me into the other question that a lot of us are wondering, once a bond agreement is set, what's the next process? Is there a possibility that Trump's, for the former president's very high-priced, high-profile attorneys will negotiate an arrangement to where he will not have to physically be present at the jail on Rice Street downtown? What's going to happen next?
Yeah, so the bond agreement is completely separate from the surrender agreement. It is possible that a surrender agreement could also be negotiated, and with someone as high profile as the former president, the Secret Service is going to weigh in as well. So even if he does have to go down to Rice Street, it's going to probably be a very streamlined process. It will be, they'll have everyone there waiting for him, rather than the experience of most defendants, which is to sit around waiting their turn for the person who does fingerprinting to become available, for the person who does mug shots, to get through everyone else before them. So it's very likely there will be some agreement in place for all the high-profile defendants and probably all the defendants to just move them through the system faster. And again, we've seen that here in Georgia before. A few years ago, there was the case involving the school board and cheating scandal on state tests, and most of those defendants had an agreement in place that allowed them to move through the process much faster than the average criminal defendant.
We were talking about the APS cheating scandal earlier in one of our editorial meetings. That really is the one that has to do with alleged white collar crimes, as opposed to other RICO cases involving young thug and some, possibly violent acts. It's really the APS cheating scandal. Is that the closest parallel that you can recall to what we're seeing today?
In Georgia, definitely. I think that is our closest parallel. If we spread nationwide, I think another close one would be the Enron case out of Texas. But since we're in Fulton County, I would say the cheating scandal is probably going to be our closest marker to see how this DA and these judges behave, especially.
Let me circle back a moment. Tell us the difference between a bond arrangement or a bond agreement and an agreement to surrender. What's the difference?
Sure. So the agreement to surrender, two parts. One we've already seen, which is to give a defendant who's not considered a high flight risk a time frame by which to turn themselves into the authorities. Usually during that time frame, the bond agreement will be reached separately. And again, the bond agreement is the amount, if any, and here it sounds like they're not nothing, but not massive amounts of money for these defendants. I think for most of us, 200,000 would be a bit difficult to raise. But for someone of, former President Trump's wealth, that should not be a major issue. That's again to pre-secure the bonds. And I'm sure there are also, and these haven't come out yet, the terms and condition of bail. So a lot of terms and condition of bail include, for example, restrictions on travel. And all of that, I'm sure, has been pre-negotiated by this point or will be before he surrenders. Conversely, the surrender agreement is both about the time to surrender, so they're given 10 days, and the manner of surrender, so where they're going to surrender. And again, given the high-profile nature of this case, and especially with the former president, the manner of surrender, meaning how quickly they'll be processed through the system.
From a realistic standpoint, from a standpoint of merely the Secret Service, is it realistic to expect that the nation's 45th president will actually appear at the Fulton County Jail for booking and mugshots?
I think it's realistic that he will be fingerprinted and mugshotted. Whether or not it includes at Fulton County Jail, I think is open for debate and is less certain, simply because of the logistics involved in securing someone like the former president and their security. So I think we are likely to see the process be followed, but possibly it being done either at a courthouse or in a subpart of the jail. So it might be on location, but in an administrative office rather than the actual normal lockup.
So along those lines, the booking and the mugshotting could actually take place perhaps at Fulton County Courthouse.
Yeah, it could be from the courthouse, again, administrative wing of the jail. Given technology today, most fingerprinting is now done electronically. So most of those are fairly portable devices. You just need a laptop and a digital camera, which are pretty readily available. So the possibility is definitely there, especially for the former president, that another location could be used.
After the booking and the mugshot, and let's say he is released on his own recognizance, I mean, or is that a possibility? Is it more likely that he will be released on his own recognizance, or will we not really know until he is officially booked?
Well, I would say actually right now it's very likely he'll be released on bond, since they seem to have reached a $200,000 agreement. It's unlikely that that's going to get backtracked later this week whenever he does choose to surrender. And that's the idea behind the bond agreement is he knows the amount he has to put down, but it's very likely he will spend very little time here in Atlanta, much like in other instances, as other surrenders.
What time frame is there for him to reasonably be booked at the Fulton County Jail? We know that the district attorney, Bonnie Willis, has given the former president and the 18 other defendants named in this until Friday to surrender themselves, so to speak. Do you think this will actually happen before the end of the week, or will we see some kind of continuance?
I think we're likely to see it happen by the end of the week. For at least the majority, I'd say all of those who already have bond agreements in place, it is very likely they will wrap this up this week. For those that do not, you could see them request a continuance to continue the bond negotiations. That'll, of course, be at the discretion of the judge whether or not to continue those. And the district attorney will have her say as well. But I think for everyone who has a bond agreement in place, they're likely to be here in the next 4 days.
After the booking and the mugshotting and the bond and bail and bond set, what happens next? Are we looking, will the next major piece come when the former president is actually arraigned? And if that's the case, how will that happen in Fulton County?
Sure. So the next major step is the arraignment. Theoretically, that could happen this week, but that's unlikely. In Georgia, arraignment isn't tied to the surrender necessarily. And with bond agreements in place, it is very likely that that'll be pushed a few weeks. That'll also allow the petition by the defendant, Mark Meadows, to go through the federal courts to see whether or not his case will be removed to federal court. So I would not be surprised to see a couple of weeks lag before the actual formal arraignment.
Do you think it's possible that the former president's attorneys based here in Atlanta will also make a move to have their case heard in a federal court, or has that deadline already passed?
So that deadline has not passed. They could still make the motion. Given the failure of a similar motion in New York, they might be a bit more reluctant. But of course, we're in a different circuit court here in Atlanta than New York. So the New York precedent doesn't bind the Atlanta federal courts. But given that a similar argument has already failed once, it is less likely they'll try it, but not impossible.
So then comes the arraignment, and then what happens next? Are we anticipating a lot of attempts or legal moves by the president and his other defendants' attorneys to add, additional hearings or appeals or objections? What will happen next after arraignment?
Sure, the standard process right after arraignment is, of course, discovery. That is the transfer of information from the prosecution to the defendants. It's standard in all cases. Given the fact there are 18 defendants, co-defendants, and it's a RICO case, that is likely to take several months to conclude. Therefore, I would expect to see a lot of legal filings by all parties. Given 18 defendants, we're going to have probably motions to sever the cases. The district attorney has stated that she wants to try all 18 together. It's going to be very likely some of those defendants are going to want to break their cases off, or at least attempt to, and that'll be at the discretion of the judge whether or not that happens. They'll have to make an argument why they should be severed from their co-defendants. But that sort of filing I would expect to occur from all 18, not just the president's team, both as a delaying tactic, but also as a legal strategy for their defenses.
Is it possible that some of these, as the former president himself has reiterated, that some of these charges could get thrown out somewhere along the way? He was last week, when the latter part of last week on Thursday, I believe, was when the former president said he was going to hold a news conference on Monday where all of these charges and allegations would be repudiated. He since has canceled that. What's your sense as far as any potential judicial ruling that could essentially completely throw out this massive, never before seen presidential indictment?
So it's always a possibility that individual charges will be removed, either at the request of the district attorney herself. She can always decide not to pursue certain charges against certain defendants. It's also possible that a judge will throw out charges because there isn't enough evidence to substantiate them, or for other procedural grounds, for example, immunity from office. That's unlikely here when we're in state court, not federal court. And the other reason is, with a 2-year grand jury investigation, this is fairly methodically done. So I'd be surprised if the district attorney didn't have her ducks in a row here.
And it's a massive case. It's never before seen. I mean, are there any other parallels from the nation's legal long history of jurisprudence and legal action that you can draw a parallel with what we're seeing now in Fulton County? We talked about the APS cheating trial in terms of its scope. Anything else that comes to mind that can even come close to what we're witnessing today?
I think the closest are probably some of the mafia trials out of New York, but most of those ended very quickly in plea deals for a large number of the defendants. And in many ways, this is a much harder case to try than a mafia case. A mafia case has violence, crimes of violence, extortion, and this is a white collar case. And that's going to be a much harder case to prove. So in that sense, I think this is unprecedented. And I think that's why the timeline of a April start date for this trial is a bit ambitious. I don't think it's impossible, but it's definitely ambitious given just the wide scope and the complexity of the laws at issue here.
How does this case compare to the other 3 criminal indictments that we've seen in Manhattan, Miami, and Washington, D.C.? This is obviously the most sweeping indictment, but how does this compare to the other challenges currently facing the former president?
So each of them poses their own unique challenges. This one I think is unique in that it's in state court, not federal court. So there's much less chance of receiving a favorable judge. State court judges tend to be much more law and order folks than our federal judges. Not to say that federal judges aren't, but there's going to be less political pressure can be brought to bear on them, I think is the way to think about it. There's also going to be fewer delays. State courts are really used to moving trials through their system fairly rapidly. And on top of that, given the RICO charges, there's a potential for very high criminal penalty and liability here. And given Georgia's unique laws about pardons that really place a criminal conviction beyond review other than our standard appeals process. But this is not simply a matter of putting political pressure on an official to pardon any of these defendants if convicted. If convicted, it's going to have to be an appeal through the state system and to the Supreme Court if they choose to take the case.
We are talking with Professor John Acevedo, a visiting associate professor at Emory Law School. Final thoughts. What's your overall impressions and opinions of the historic nature of what has already been a 2.5-year special grand jury investigation into the alleged election interference or attempts to overturn Georgia's 2020 presidential election, to today's news that in this week's news that bond agreements are being set for the 45th president of the United States and 18 other co-defendants. Final thoughts on this historic occasion?
I would say one is we can't underestimate how historic it is. I kind of view this as a Watergate meets O.J. Simpson in terms of the kind of press coverage it's going to receive. And really what we're looking at here is every moment is setting a new precedent. And this is rare in law. In law, we're lucky if one case gives us one new rule of law, and this one is going to give us dozens. Every day, every action that is done is charting new waters. So in that sense, I think that's one of the, from a legal perspective, at least one of those very interesting moments to watch. I think that also for me is comforting to see that the system is working kind of as normal. Nothing is really unique here. It's variations off a kind of common play. Again, given the APS case, we've seen high-profile defendants receive the sorts of deals that these defendants are receiving. It's the standard process, and that should give comfort to the listeners out there that this really is the process working as it should.
And we're continuing to follow these developments regarding Donald Trump's indictments here in Fulton County and elsewhere. Here is Professor John Acevedo, a visiting associate professor of law at Emory University, to really tell us what's next in terms of what we can expect over the coming few days and the coming few weeks regarding Donald Trump's legal challenges. Former President Donald Trump has reportedly agreed to surrender himself on Thursday of this week at the Fulton County Jail in downtown Atlanta. And all of this is happening while the other Republican hopefuls for the White House in 2024 are set to debate Wednesday night in Milwaukee, and we're joined by Professor Glenn Smith, a political science professor at the University of North Georgia, one of their several campuses across the northern part of our state. And Professor, really, we were kind of wondering here in the newsroom when the nation's 45th president would agree to surrender himself for booking and mugshotting, whether or not it would be Wednesday, the day of the debate, the day after, Friday. And turns out Donald Trump has chosen Thursday to reportedly surrender himself. What are the strategic political implications of this kind of decision? Is he really just making sure that he stays at the front of the news cycle?
Yeah, I think it's the best day politically for him to surrender himself, because it's not really the debate, it's the after media coverage the next day, right? And so now the 24-hour news networks are going to be focused on him Thursday rather than showing clips of Chris Christie attacking him or Ron DeSantis or any of the other Republican candidates. And that's what he wants. He wants the focus to be on him, his battle against the deep state and the FBI, and his whole campaign. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a perfect day. I wouldn't be surprised if he knows this and he's planned and negotiated that be the day that he can take the oxygen away from the other candidates.
Would there have been any other advantage for him to perhaps have chosen Wednesday? Would he not, if he had surrendered himself or was planning to surrender himself Wednesday afternoon, only hours before the Republican debate in Milwaukee, could he not have accomplished the same thing?
No, I don't think so, because then they would have covered that surrendering and then the debate, and then that's what they're going to talk about, right? The media would shift gears. So you understand a lot of media, it's like, what's the current news story, right? That's why it's called news, right? Whatever the news story is, that's what's going to be covered. And they're going to cover a Republican national presidential debate. I mean, that's going to happen, but it's just how long does that linger in the dialogue? So it's about interrupting the news cycle after the effect. So I think it's much more advantageous to have it on Thursday to prevent that news coverage from having any kind of legs. Any stories that might come out of the debate about this candidate looking strong or that candidate looking strong. This allows Donald Trump to focus all the Republican attention on him. And again, right now, it's all about Republicans. It's about what they're going to be focused on. He's not worried about the general election at this point.
Let's talk about the general election. A couple of weeks ago and I want to say it was in Montgomery, Alabama, the former president had a rally and he basically said he needs one more indictment to win the election. Is there any truth to his assertions that his approval ratings go up every time he has faced an indictment? Is that accurate?
I wouldn't say every time. I think the first indictment out of Manhattan, he did see an increase in the polls, and he actually consolidated it where Ron DeSantis was doing much better, and then all of a sudden the indictment in Manhattan, and then Donald Trump just shot up in the polls. But then after the federal indictments, you saw a little small dip in the polls for Donald Trump. So there was a little bit that he was hurt. And after this latest one, I mean, the only poll I saw recently was out of Iowa, and he's doing very well. I think he was at 41%, if I remember correctly. So still doing very well, but I haven't seen any increase in the polls after the Georgia indictment. But again, it's still fairly early. And even though the Iowa poll I'm referencing, half of it was done before the indictment and half was after. So we just kind of have to wait and see how those polls come out. But I wouldn't say every single time he's been indicted he's done better, but it hasn't cost him anything in the Republican nomination.
How do you explain the fact that he is the clear front runner in the Republican primaries when he has 4 criminal indictments? His presidency was already marked by several historic firsts in terms of the number of impeachments, the number of exonerations. Now, the first ex-president in history to be criminally indicted not once, but 4 times. And yet he has a very core group of solid, diehard supporters, whereas maybe his political opponents are wondering, why does a man who's facing 4 criminal indictments, why is he leaning so far ahead of his Republican opponents?
I could write an entire book on that. Just answering that one question. There's a lot of different facets to it. I mean, some of it is, he has his core supporters, and they see it as all the indictments are proof of what Donald Trump's been saying, that he is being attacked by what he calls the deep state, that this is Joe Biden's political persecutions, and this is what he says, that it's all written by Joe Biden, and so they're attacking him because they see him as the strongest. So he's obviously very adept at spinning news to his favor to make him seem like the one that they want to go after, and so that just hardens his group of supporters. The more that they see it as a political persecution rather than a legal prosecution, the more they're going to support him. Now, the other part of it is, I'm always skeptical of polls this time of the election. I mean, you look back and it's really just about name recognition at this point. So we had at this point in the campaign, in past years, we had Rudy Giuliani leading. We had Newt Gingrich leading. Rick Perry led at one point, and I think it was in 2008. So we've had lots of people that ended up fizzling out. I'm not saying Donald Trump will, but if you look at the campaign right now, he has by far the most name recognition. And there's another kind of storyline going around that, well, we've never seen a president, a Republican or any nomination where a candidate's had this big a lead and lost. Well, we've also, since we've had polling, never seen, as you mentioned, a president, an ex-president running for re-election. We haven't seen it since Teddy Roosevelt. So, and we don't have any polls back then, so we don't know, how it's going to play out. There's no precedent for this historically, at least in the polling era, in the modern era, we don't have a precedent. So it could just be that when people are asked questions in the polls, they know Donald Trump, he's a given commodity, but that doesn't mean they're not at least thinking about other candidates. I think of it like buying a car. Okay, you have your Ford F-150 and it's dying. You got to get a new car. You love Ford F-150, right? That's your backup. But aren't you a little curious about what Dodge has to offer or what another car company has to offer? So you want to check out the features, right? This is where they're going to learn. They're going to start learning in these debates about some of these more unknown candidates, right? Okay, what does DeSantis have to offer? Victor Ramaswamy, largely unknown to the national public. Even the governor of I think it's North Dakota, right? They don't know anything about him. So once they start to learn about them, and then the dynamics really shift when the voting starts. And that's when in the past presidential Republican and Democratic nominations, things really change and it's so dynamic and so fluid, where you'll see 20-point drops or 20-point gains in the polls in a week. And so right now I'm just skeptical. It's really about name recognition. Once the voting starts, that's how we get a President Jimmy Carter in the past, right? That he was largely unknown. All of a sudden he wins Iowa and he's the Democratic nominee. Same thing kind of happened with John Kerry, actually.
And that's something we're going to continue to follow, obviously, here at Atlanta News First. One final question, and then we'll wrap up. The former president's claims that the Democratic Party under President Joe Biden is weaponizing his words, the Department of Justice, to go after someone who will likely be her at this point is a likely contender to be the Republican nominee in a year from now. How much weight will that claim, will that assertion have in the general election? Crystal ball, of course.
In my opinion, none. In the general election, the only people who, if you look at polls that believe that, and it's Republicans that believe it, people who are already going to vote either for Trump or for whoever is the Republican nominee. So I don't see it having much. I mean, it's not going to sway independents. If you look at polls, independents don't buy that. They think this is a legitimate prosecution. They think Trump should be prosecuted, especially, and when you look at independents, their biggest issue is with the classified documents case. They see that as the most damning indictment. And I think the Georgia indictment's going to get a lot of press during the general election. If the trial happens next year, that'll get a lot of the press because it allows cameras in the courtroom. But I think the more damning indictment is probably the classified documents case because of the national security implications of it.
Because that was a federal indictment and all
Yes.
the others have been pretty much local, Manhattan and Georgia. Am I correct?
Yes. So I think the Georgia indictment, if the trial happens next year, it'll hurt him in Georgia because it'll get a lot of local media coverage that usually don't cover a lot of national politics. This story aside, obviously. But I think nationally, if the trial is going on the federal indictments case, I think that's where you're going to see that might hurt him in the general. The more attention is paid to that rather than Joe Biden.
We're wrapping up our conversation with Professor Glenn Smith, a professor of political science at the University of North Georgia. Final thoughts, things to keep in mind over the next week or so.
Week or so, you said?
Over the next week or so.
Oh, next week or so. I think that let's see if I wanted to say that I think the audience for the Republican nomination, you're going to see the Chris Christie, especially try to go after Donald Trump and goad him into debating. So I think part of the audience for tomorrow night is Donald Trump himself, right? Because he doesn't like being hit where he can't hit back. So it's going to be interesting to see how much, especially Christie, who's been open. He's called him a coward in the media, just openly trying to get Donald Trump and to get him to the debate stage so he can take him on one-on-one. So it'll be interesting to see how much they go after Donald Trump, not just Christie, but others as well, whether they're willing to hit him or not.
And we'll be following these issues and many more here on Atlanta News First. Thanks to Professor Glenn Smith of the University of Georgia. Thanks all of you for watching Atlanta News First.
And that was our Tim Darnell with a weekly installment of Political Update. We try to get you caught up on the latest headlines here in Georgia and recently national headlines tied to local headlines. As we continue this, I do want to break in with some news that we received into our newsroom really moments ago. Attorneys for Rudy Giuliani, known as America's mayor, have reached a bond agreement on his behalf. That bond is set at $150,000, so a little shy of what former President Donald Trump's bond was, which was $200,000. Rudy Giuliani will be expected to settle that bond of $150,000. There's a number of ways to do that, as you might remember from our earlier conversation with Brendan Keefe as we got into some of that. But that is the first step in the surrender process that we've seen play out with a number of people that have been named in this indictment. Rudy Giuliani, obviously a well-known national political figure, is in Fulton County right now. We saw his plane touch down here. I'm going to pull up this video. This is file footage from CNN. We saw him land in DeKalb Peachtree Airport, and as you can see in this file video, load up into a car, and then we saw that car drive away. He has not surrendered at this moment. Part of that surrender terminology includes the official arrest, the booking, the mugshot that is going to come, as the sheriff said, for all of these people who are expected to turn themselves in no later than noon on Friday. A lot of them are already taking care of that, turning themselves into Fulton County Jail, facing arrest. Some of those mugshots that we've seen come out have already been released to the public. We will expect Rudy Giuliani's mugshot as well. The sheriff's office has been clear that this process is going to be the same and in line with how they book people at the Fulton County Jail. And really, for a lot of people, the question is, does this all apply to former President Donald Trump? I mean, you're talking about a former president who has a security detail, who's entitled to that security detail, but has to report to jail to be arrested and booked. That remains to be seen how that will all play out. Right now, from what we're told by sheriff's office, sheriff's officials, is that he will be fingerprinted, he will be arrested, and he will have his mugshot. That remains to be seen as we anticipate tomorrow the former president arriving in Fulton County to surrender. His bond agreement, again, is set at $200,000. We're going to continue to follow that coverage with you, but right now I want to take you back to Rudy Giuliani here. Those were attorneys for Giuliani who are here in Fulton County as well, negotiating that bond agreement that has been reached. $150,000 is the word, but before he took off for Fulton County, for DeKalb Peachtree Airport, this is what he said. I'm going to pull up this quote right here, if it'll load. There we go. These words earlier today from Rudy Giuliani saying, quote, "I'm going to Fulton County to comply with the law, which I always do. I don't know if I plead today, but if I do, I plead not guilty and I get photographed. Isn't that nice? A mugshot for the man who probably put the worst criminals of the 20th century in jail. You find a prosecutor who has a better record than mine in the last 100 years. Bet you don't. Or a mayor. They're going to degrade themselves by doing a mugshot of me, like people will recognize it. And of course they can fingerprint me, but I've been fingerprinted 150 times. This will turn out exactly like the FBI search turned out. They're lying. I'm telling the truth." Those words from Rudy Giuliani, again, who is now in Fulton County. Those are his attorneys you're looking at right there. And earlier today, that is the man himself, America's mayor, getting into a vehicle. He has landed in Fulton County. He has not officially surrendered. This is a live picture right now of Fulton County Jail, where we are staked out, essentially. We're waiting to see the arrival of Rudy Giuliani to this jail. This is where we've seen a number of people who have been indicted so far appear and get booked and their mugshot taken. I'm going to pull up some of those images right now for you, if you could bear with me while I do that here. All right, this is our Atlanta News First website, where we've been putting out the latest developments and everything that we're learning in this indictment. Really, you can go all the way back to our initial reporting when this investigation from Fani Willis's office first broke, the special grand jury, all of it. This is over 2 years of coverage that we've been following. But most recently, every single development that's come out is available on our website and in our app, Atlanta News First. It's a free app. You can download it. And the best thing about that is it will send notifications to your phone. For example, the arrival and surrender at Fulton County Jail of Rudy Giuliani. We will push that out to you as soon as we learn anything. But getting back to what I want to show you all here, and those were a couple mugshots that we received here into the newsroom. I'm going to try to pull that up here. Actually, I believe I have it up at the top, and we showed you these earlier. This is our live updates. If you're trying to follow along with all the developments coming out of today, which there have been a lot, there we go. David Schaefer, that mugshot coming out of Fulton County Jail, and of course the other one, John Eastman, both named in the indictment, as well as a total of 19 people named. One of the most prominent, of course, former President Donald Trump. These are the types of mugshots that we are going to expect to see out of Fulton County as more and more people reach their bond agreements and surrender to Fulton County Jail. So we'll be continuing to follow that. For the time being, make sure you have that app downloaded. I can't express that enough. That is going to be the best way for you to keep up with our Georgia indictment coverage and anything that comes out of it. Here in a moment, we're going to be taking you to our Atlanta News First newscast starting at 3 with the latest coverage and what we're learning. Earlier, we had political reporter Doug Reardon on with us. He'll be bringing you an update from the ground, from outside of Fulton County Jail. This is where he is right now, bringing us this live shot, and we've been keeping a very close eye to see who will appear at the jail. Rudy Giuliani is a big name of somebody who is expected to appear, along with others that still have yet to surrender. I can't emphasize enough, the deadline, as laid out by Fani Willis, as laid out by the sheriff's office, is noon on Friday. If they do not surrender by then they will have a warrant out for their arrest. Now, what that looks like remains to be seen, but right now we are anticipating the surrender of many characters, including former President Donald Trump, of course, tomorrow, anticipated to arrive, as he and his team have outlined. Rudy Giuliani right here, pulling up a picture of him, a file video, as he has reached a bond agreement with Fulton County officials and is expected to surrender at the jail. So we'll keep it right here with the latest coverage on Atlanta News First and Atlanta News First Plus.